like reconciliation between God and.
So welcome back. Yeah, so I've had an interesting week. I hope you all have too. Last week, those that were here, we had the whole setup back there, and everything's going fine, and get done, and go back and realize that I had never turned the camera on. So
Is it on now?
it is on now. Yes, so I made sure it was on. So if that wasn't good enough, forgetting to turn the camera on. We had a play downtown yesterday at the Chicago Shakespeare Theater, and there's two venues there. There's the Courtyard Theater and there's the Yard. And I knew this one was at the Yard, which is the other venue down there. And so we were kind of wondering about the time. So I pulled out the ticket, and I looked at the ticket, and I confirmed from the ticket that the play started at 2 o'clock. So we're like, oh, that's a half hour earlier than we expected. We need to kind of get busy and kind of get moving. So we did. We got all ready to go, hopped in the car, drove down to Navy Pier, pulled into the parking lot at Navy Pier, and the door was closed for the parking entrance that we usually use, which was a shock because we'd never had this problem. And so we frantically, came up with plan B, and I dropped Debbie off, and I ran around to another entrance of the parking garage at Navy Pier, and I got into the parking garage. As I got into the parking garage, I get a phone call. I dropped her off from Debbie, who's standing at the theater and noticing that the theater is closed. Tell me, she says, the theater is closed. And she didn't quite put it in this tone of voice, but basically it was like, I looked at the ticket and noticed that the play isn't until February. I'm like, how about that? So all the way down, we were talking about what a beautiful day it was to go to Navy Pier yesterday, because it was a beautiful, beautiful day there. We got ice cream. Yeah, we got ice cream. So so I'm on a roll. I'm gonna say January is my month.
We had time to re-record though the thing from
Yeah,
last week.
yeah. I went downstairs and just sat at my table and did it from there. So, all right. Well, speaking of January, today is January 21st, a red letter day in history. Now, of course, to me, every day is a red letter day in history, but there are a lot of neat things that happen on this date. For example, on this date in 1077, Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, petitioned Gregory the Ninth and Pope Gregory IV for forgiveness for going up against him. And this is the story about where he goes and meets him in the snow and has to sit outside for 3 days waiting for the Pope to forgive him. And this was like a red letter day. And it was interesting because I'm like 30 pages from the end of a book by Tom Holland, who's a historian, Christian historian, who starts his book about the domination, how Christendom came to dominate the world, the Western world at least. And he starts and ends with this story. That this is the high point. This is the point where the Catholic Church, what was then called, the Catholic, the Universal Church, came to dominate the Western world. But it was on this date in 1077. In 1525, another red letter day. On 1525, Conrad Grebel baptizes George Blaurock, and then Felix Mons, who then turned around and baptized Conrad Grebel, and a dozen others in Felix Mons' mother's house. This is today is the birthday of the Anabaptists. Okay, so all three of these guys went on to be either exiled or killed for their Anabaptist belief. The idea, these guys had split off of Zwingli's Geneva Reformation. You had the Reformation the Reformation going on in Germany, and then you had the Reformation going on in Geneva, led by Zwingli. And the Anabaptists split off of them and said, Zwingli, they had a debate where, Zwingli's argument was if it's not in the Bible, you shouldn't do it. The one exception was infant baptism. And Grabel, Mons, and Blaurock said, wait a minute, Zwingli, that's not in the Bible either. And Zwingli's response was something along the line of, so what? And ultimately, the Anabaptists were chased down, hunted, and pretty much killed. Everybody hated the Anabaptists. Everybody did. Until finally one lived long enough to develop some followers and find a safe place, and that was Menno Simons. And the people who followed him took his name, and we call them the Mennonites today. So that's where the Anabaptists are not. As a Baptist, we don't look back and go, "Oh yeah, that's our great grandfather there." It's more of a distant cousin kind of thing. I mean, the Baptist position is to hold on to believers' baptism, but the Anabaptists had a lot more, and nowadays they are the Mennonites, of whom the Amish are actually a split off of the Mennonites. So there are some relationships between the Baptist distinctives and Amish distinctives for those who keep track of these sort of things. In 1672, a church in Bedford, England, called John Bunyan to be its pastor. John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. It's interesting that at the time he was called to be their pastor, he was in prison. I just find that interesting because, we're going through a pastoral search at the moment. And I know they looked high and low, but I don't think they ever looked in the prisons. Did you guys? I don't just that's where they found John Bunyan. I'm just saying, But so that was on this date in 1672. Louis XVI was executed today. The King of France in 1793, along with his wife, Marie Antoinette. Read a book once about the last couple of years of Louis XVI's life. It was really pretty sad. I mean, obviously, when your life ends with you getting guillotined, it's not going to have a happy ending. But it was a sad. This was a guy who was just in over his head, and that's the trouble when you had. I mean, no pun intended. I'm trying to be funny there, but it was just kind of a sad. Things just overwhelmed him. And he ended up kind of just getting killed. It was kind of a foregone conclusion. Speaking of death, in 1921, Agatha Christie's first novel was published, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Has anybody read that? Good book. Really, really good book. Nikolai Lenin died on this date in 1924, 100 years ago today. And last I checked on the internet, and supposedly at this point, still 2.5 million people every year go to Red Square to see his body.
I've seen it. Been there.
There you go.
1989.
So yeah, it's still there. It's still on display. They say it's him. I got reason to believe it is, but he died on this date in 1924. I read a biography of Lenin once. It was really kind of interesting. He was an interesting guy, but died 100 years ago today. In 1971, the TV show Alias Smith and Jones debuted. Anybody remember that show? I don't know why. That was a show that we used to watch that show all the time. Kind of a takeoff on the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid sort of story, and but yeah, a couple of interesting birthdays today. Speaking of Russians, it's Rasputin's birthday today. Grigory Rasputin, who was born in 1869 and supposedly died in 1916. Now, I don't really know. I mean, that was one of the things. It was hard to kill the guy. I believe he was stabbed, and then he was shot, and then he was drowned and poisoned, and the guy kept coming back. So for all I know, he's living down the street today to this day. Karl Wallenda was born on this day. The Flying Wallendas. Does anybody remember them? He was the patriarch of the family. He was born in this state in 1905. And finally, I know I told you this was a red letter day. This was a red letter day. Today is Paul Scofield's birthday. Paul Scofield. And I say that he had nothing to do with the Scofield Bible. Just going to get that out of the way right off the top of the head. It is not any relation. Well, I don't know if there's any relation. I mean, how many people are named Scofield? But Paul Scofield was a great British actor and was known for doing stage, a lot of Shakespeare. So that's how I would know Paul Scofield. But today is his birthday. I believe, if you've watched any of the big epics of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s British movies, you probably saw Paul Scofield in something. So yeah, that's today. That's January 21st. So all right, we are looking at 1 Corinthians. Today we're going to talk about 1 Corinthians 12. Remember, 1 Corinthians is a letter from the Apostle Paul to the church at Corinth, a church that he had spent extensive time with, a church that he had corresponded with before, a church that he had contacts with, a church that was kind of going off the rails to a certain extent. Certainly it wasn't following exactly what Paul wanted it to. And he had heard things and he had read things about the various issues at the church. And part of this letter, again, this letter is at least the second letter from Paul to Corinth. Okay, we know that there was an earlier one. So it could be that Paul wrote a letter, they wrote a response, and this is Paul's response to that letter. We don't know. We know that they had written a letter, and this is a response to Paul's letter. Now, we don't know what's in the letter from the church at Corinth, and we don't know exactly what is happening at the church of Corinth. Okay, and that is one of the considerations you have to take. In fact, you have to take that with any epistle. You have to understand that it's one side of the conversation, and you kind of have to speculate to sometimes it's pretty clear. Other times you kind of have to go, what? What are they talking about here? But sometimes it's easy to do, sometimes it's a little more difficult. Okay? So, in 1 Corinthians, the first 7 chapters of Corinthians is talking about things he's heard about. First 6 chapters. Then in chapter 7, verse 1, Paul says, now about the things you wrote. And then the majority of what Paul's talking about from chapter 7 through the end has to do with things that are written in their letter. Okay? But not everything. Every once in a while he slips in with something like, yeah, and I heard this too. Okay, so Paul is somebody who had his ear to the ground. Now keep in mind, he'd been the pastor of the church. He had been the leader of the church, certainly the apostle in the community there at Corinth for quite some time. Beginning in chapter 10, we're talking about. Beginning with chapter 11, Paul goes into a section where he deals with problems in worship. Okay, and last week, the first one we talked about was about head coverings, on whether or not women needed to wear head coverings, or whether we talked about this, with head coverings or hair, and whatever it was I said, it did not succeed in getting any of the women to wear head coverings. I'm just, but be that as it may. Yeah, it's gone the opposite direction in some here. So, and last week we talked about some of the issues with the Lord's Supper. And Paul was talking about, and if you remember last week we talked about here that the Lord's Supper there was a horizontal element that was being ignored that we tend not to pay attention to in modern Western usage. That we focus on, being right with God individually, which is important, but the problem that Paul had with the Lord's Supper was not that you were, had sin in your life while taking the Lord's Supper. The problem Paul had, and he talks about, is that when you guys go to the Lord's Supper, there are people that are eating a lot, there are people that are going hungry. That the Lord's Supper, what he was calling the Lord's Supper, was supposed to be this radical picture of the community of God, and it wasn't. It was just a reflection of society. The rich were having their thing, the poor weren't getting anything, and Paul was saying that that's got to stop. Now today we're going to talk about the third problem and that is about problem with the gifts of the Spirit, problem concerning spiritual gifts. Okay, concerning spiritual gifts. Now, in verse 1, I'm in chapter 12, beginning with 1. He says, "Now about the gifts of the Spirit, brothers and sisters, I do not want you to be uninformed." Okay. Now, its suggestion here is that he's going back to what was mentioned in the letter. Okay. We don't know that for a fact, but we're thinking, okay, so maybe they asked him a question about spiritual gifts. Maybe they asked him a question about, okay, so-and-so keeps speaking in tongues, and so this person does that, and I don't know, what's the deal here? What are we supposed to do? Okay. Paul says, I do not want you to be uninformed. So let me lay it straight to you here. First of all, you know that when you were pagans, somehow or other you were influenced and led astray to mute idols. Okay? So Paul reminds the church of their pagan background. Okay? Kind of this is and I think to a certain point Paul wants to, you guys, you remember one of the problems with the church at Corinth, and I haven't talked about this in a while, but one of the problems with the church at Corinth was that their sense of realized eschatology, this idea that they had achieved the height of Christian life, that this was as good as it gets. We're there, we've arrived, everything is good. This is it, we're done. Okay, and Paul is like, you guys started out as pagans. Okay, let's remember where you came from. Okay, let's get that straight. And then let's talk about what God has done for you, okay? And then he says, verse 3, "Therefore I want you to know that no one who is speaking by the Spirit of God says Jesus be cursed, and no one can say Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit." Okay? Now this is a confusing sentence, okay? Because on the one hand, certainly people can say Jesus is cursed, or Jesus is his Lord, with or without the Holy Spirit. Okay, so it's like, okay, what is going on here? What is he talking about? So obviously there's more to it than just saying it. Okay, so we don't know. It may involve, and this is your third dot here, it may involve a hypothetical situation. Perhaps in part in the letter somebody was wondering if you could be a believer and stand up under the power of the Holy Spirit and say something bad about Jesus. So it may be a hypothetical situation. Okay? It may involve a real event. Okay? There may be some squirrel deacon in the bunch who likes to get up and say, or there may be somebody who refuses to attend the church and says, oh, well, no, Jesus is Lord. Okay? And they're kind of trying to figure this out. Or it may be just a revelation of the Spirit's role in the assembly. And I think the third thing is more likely kind of setting the stage to say, listen, you guys need to understand the role of the Spirit in the assembly here. And I think that's kind of the point that he's making. Yes?
I may have missed it, but in point 2, there's that blank IOW.
Oh, Gentile. In other words, Gentile.
Thank you.
So again, there is a Jewish component in the church at Corinth. There are Jews there, but it is by and large a pagan Gentile church. Okay. So he says, now keep that in mind, the role of the Spirit in the assembly, that there's a role of the Spirit in the assembly. It isn't all about you. There's the Holy Spirit has a role there, and he's going to start talking about it here. And he says, there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in every one, it is the same gift at work. Okay, so 12:4 through 6 indicates different types of gifts, service, and working, but the source is the same. Okay, and he said, and what's interesting here is he talks about the same Spirit, the same Lord, the same God. Which leads me to the next thing, that this, in parentheses, that this is, given that Corinthians is one of the earlier of the epistles that's written. This is one of the earliest, what are referred to as Trinitarian references. The idea that there are three aspects to the character of God, okay, or the nature of God. Nature of God, I think is the better. Okay, this is one of the earliest ones. Okay, Now, again, when you start talking about the doctrine of the, okay, I'm out.
Okay, no, go ahead.
I don't, I picked up the pile of paper and I'm like, that seemed pretty light today, but again, this isn't a good week for me. So I told you all that earlier. So I'm surprised I've got the paper here at all. So, so when we talk about theologies, we talk about creating a theology of anything. And usually when it says, I'm going to teach you about any subject, that's usually what's referred to as a systematic theology, where you take a particular Bible verse from this book and you take a particular Bible verse, and I'm oversimplifying. You take a Bible verse from this book, you take a Bible verse from that book, you take a Bible verse from that book, and you put the three together and say, well, since there's a common inspirational source, they should all deal with the same thing. How do we put them all together and come up with a coherent explanation? And that's the essence of a systematic theology. So you take all of these different verses and say, well, this verse, and this verse. Whereas a biblical theology is looking at just what does a particular book say? What does a particular text say? And that's kind of more the focus of what I'm doing. So you could take whatever, I'm just saying this is one of the texts that if you're going to do a theology of the Trinity, this is one of the texts you're going to deal with. Same thing with the Spirit and talking about spiritual gifts and things like that. Again, Paul has a particular point that he's going to make here to the church at Corinth, okay, about spiritual gifts or about the manifestations of the Spirit. And then you can use those with other passages and come up with an idea of how spiritual gifts work. And I'll talk about that a little bit as we go. Sorry, let me get back on track. Okay, this is believed to be one of the earliest Trinitarian references in the New Testament. Now, despite our desire to differentiate, okay, and when Paul uses a phrase like there's different kinds of work, there's different kinds of service, there's different kinds of gifts, okay, there's a tendency that we want to say, okay, gifts refers to this, and works refers to this, and service refers to this, okay, because that's how we are. He's probably just three different ways of saying the same thing, okay, that the Spirit works in different ways, works, service, call it whatever you want. It's sort of like the idea of like, there's a verse, speaking to yourselves in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Where's that? Does anybody know? It's in Galatians, Ephesians. Someone know where that is? Pardon me? Colossians. I was going to get to it eventually. Galatians, Ephesians. Eventually I was going to get to it. Same thing, it's like, I've been in sermons where it's like, okay, this is a spiritual song, this is a hymn, and that's okay. But really just Paul is just throwing out, hey, whatever you want to call them. Whatever you want to call them. Psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, doesn't matter. And I think here Paul is doing the same thing. The Spirit works in a lot of different ways, okay? If you want to split them up, go ahead. I don't think Paul is trying to do that. So despite our desire to differentiate, Paul is probably talking about three different ways to describe the same thing, and that is the manifestation of the Spirit. The manifestation of the Spirit. We'll pick up this phrase again in verse 7. Now to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. Okay. Now this is the key verse of this chapter, of his whole argument. Okay, and you'll see it's written down there at the bottom. Now to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. Now there's a, we've all, I shouldn't say we've all, but it's very common if you've been in church for any length of time, and I know we've done it here, where we talk about, we present a theology of spiritual gifts. And usually it goes something like that, God has given each one of you an individual gift. Okay, and it's your responsibility to discover what that gift is and to develop that gift and use that gift for the kingdom. And that's all fine. Okay, and usually it involves asking people, and very often it involves taking a test somewhere. Okay, and you go, how many of you have taken the test? Come on, confess. How many of you have taken the test? Yeah. I've been taking these tests since I was, I think 12. I was 12 the first time. I took one of these, fill in this blank. If you get more A's than B's, you're this. If you go B's and C's, then this. Basically, I've discovered that I have the spiritual gift of forgetfulness. It's my gift. Right there? Okay, just take. But I did remember to bring the handouts today. So again, and I remember to turn the video on. So I'm on a roll. And I've tried giving other things, creating other things as spiritual gifts, but Debbie would ask me questions like, "Why did you leave a mess on the kitchen table?" And it's like, well, it's my gift. She's not buying it. But I think what Paul is talking about here, and the problem with the gift idea, and this is I'm slipping off into my opinion here. I've always had trouble with this. Take a test, and it'll tell you the gift that God gave you. It'll tell you certain skills. Personally, I think the best way to know if you have a spiritual gift is people will tell you. How do you know you have the spiritual gift? People will tell you. Oh, I believe God has given me the gift of helps. Okay, so and I think there's a point to say, well, convince somebody that he or she has a gift of something, and then they're motivated to try in that particular area, and I get that. Just remember there was, again, I keep going back to a couple of stories. I was involved in a church once, and the pastor told me that on the same day he had a meeting with a husband and a wife. I know I've told this story before, but in the morning the husband came in to talk to the pastor to tell him that he felt God was calling him to preach. Okay, great, it's a great conversation and all that kind of stuff. And in the afternoon, the wife came in to tell the pastor that she didn't think her husband was saved. Like, okay, somebody's not, so this guy, again, it's just kind of an interesting thing. But I think when Paul is talking here about the church, he's talking about the way the Spirit underlies things. Okay? And he's talking about the manifestation of the Spirit, that the Spirit, when the Spirit allows somebody to minister in a way, that in and of itself is a gift. It isn't necessarily a gift, because the problem with the spiritual gift, then it to a certain extent it becomes about you. Okay, I have this gift. I have the gift of this. And sometimes the trouble is that when people say they have the gift, then it puts the burden on the receiver. Okay, so if I got up here and said, I have the gift of teaching, which I'm not claiming, okay? If I say I have the gift of teaching and you guys aren't learning anything, well, then it's your fault, because I've got the gift, okay? So again, I'm exaggerating. It's just my weird way of thinking, things like that. But Paul is talking about the manifestation of the Spirit. He says the manifestation of the Spirit shows in many ways that there are times when that the Lord will give somebody the right thing to say at the right time. Okay, or the right help at the right time. Okay, he may never. Have you ever talked to, or even with a kid, where you're talking to somebody and they give you the answer to a problem you've had, and you have never in a million years expected that person to know that. TV writers, do the precocious kid on the TV show. That's how you know a sitcom is dying, because they bring in the cousin from afar, the little kid, to rescue the TV show, and the precocious little kid to come in and say these, preternaturally wise things, sort of stuff. But so he says in verse 7, now to each one the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. Okay, so the key there is the common good. Okay? When Paul talked about the problems with the Lord's Supper, the problems with the Lord's Supper was you had this disparity. Okay, there was no common good. Some people were enjoying it a lot, some people weren't enjoying it at all, and the community was just looking at it and going, wow, what a bunch of, they're no different than the rest of us, kind of thing, okay? So to one there is given through the Spirit a message of wisdom, to another a message of knowledge by means of the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by that one Spirit, to another miraculous powers, to another prophecy, to another distinguishing between spirits, to another speaking in different kinds of tongues, and to still another the interpretation of tongues. All these are the work of one and the same Spirit, and he distributes them to each one just as he determines. Okay? So, all of these, see above, should work for the common good. And then Paul lists several, verses 8, several of these manifestations of the Spirit. Okay, so when Paul is talking about his spiritual gifts, the other way he refers to them is they are a manifestation of the Spirit. And I like to think that rather than there being some permanent gift, that the Spirit is willing to use people in ways for the common good. And focusing too much on, oh, well, my spiritual gift is preaching, I should let somebody else do that over there. You know, or you say something like, well, my spiritual gift isn't, I'm not a teacher. How many of you heard that? I'm not a teacher. I could never be a teacher. You know, because it's like, oh, well, teaching, the only kind of teaching that a person can do is like this. You know, you stand up here and sometimes you remember to turn the video on, sometimes you don't. Okay? This is the only kind of teaching you can do. And we had a discussion on this earlier. I forget when it was, but you know, when does discipleship happen? That it isn't necessarily a formal process. It isn't necessarily that, okay, Debbie, Tuesday at 2:00 we're going to sit down and you're going to be discipled. Okay, I mean, discipleship happens, you know, when you least expect it. Something happens and somebody wiser or in the right moment at the right time says the right thing. Okay, there's an issue that comes up and somebody who you didn't expect to have the answer has the answer. Okay, you pick up a book off the, sometimes you pick a book up off the shelf, and this happens to me all the time. I bought a book back in 1997, and I put it on my to be read book. Pardon me? Just one? Just one. And I put it on the shelf, and then 15 years later, I'm walking along the shelf and I go, that's an interesting book. Have anybody bought the same book twice? I've never done that. No. And you go, wow, that looks like a really good book, and you buy it, and then you go to put it on the shelf, and you realize, ooh, I've already bought this book, kind of thing. But then you pick it up and read it. And you go, wow, that was a great book.
Just take it back.
Yeah. Well, the trouble is when I buy books at things like antique malls and Goodwill, because it looks good at the moment. I go back and hey, I've already got that book, kind of thing. And sometimes I'll have them and give them out to people, or if they figure Goodwill's not a good place for this. But then I should leave it there but I forget that I have it. But you know what I mean? It's like you just, all of a sudden you think, oh, you pick up this book and you read it. Or somebody casually mentions something to you that says, oh, go look at it. We were talking about this the other, Debbie and I were talking about this on the way up about, if somebody says to me, oh, this is I read this book. I learned this from this book. Very, very often I'll make a note, check out this book. Make a note of it. And then I'll see it in a garage sale, or I'll see it in Goodwill and I'll buy it. And then I'll see it in Amazon and I'll buy it again. I think by the third time I have to read it. Because it goes over a lot better when I say, hey, Deb, listen, I read this great book. It really changed my life. And by the way, I bought it 3 times. Than if I say, hey, guess what? I bought this book 3 times and have yet to read it. She doesn't like that one. Right? It doesn't go over quite as well. She just then sits down and says, well, you're going to read it 3 times, then, aren't you? Kind of thing. I'm just kidding. I've never bought a book 3 times, I think. After a while, you forget. But regardless, so Paul lists several of these, okay? And again, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. And, a message of wisdom. How many of you have ever had somebody just give you the message of wisdom and go, oh, you have a problem with the kid, you have a problem at work, and somebody just in a very short period of time says, somebody, in the church says, oh, well, here's what you should do, or here's what I think. And you go, wow, that's Why didn't I think of that? Right? Okay, again, it's a manifestation of the Spirit. Does this person have a gift of it? Maybe. He certainly had the gift for that moment. Okay? Again, there's nothing wrong with saying I've got a gift and discovering your gift. Go ahead. I'm just saying let's not limit ourselves to saying, okay, this is how, if the Spirit's going to work through me, it's going to be through preaching. Okay? That's always a good one. People think, God has called me to preach. And they go to the pastor. God has called me to preach, thinking, sign me up for next Sunday. And the pastor's like, I think every pastor has had this problem. The guy, well, it's not quite that easy. Oh, are you going to quench the Spirit? Yeah, that's what I'm going to do, kind of thing. But a message of knowledge. Okay, a message of knowledge. Just again, knowing something that needs to be known. Okay, this is not necessarily my gift because I more have the gift of unnecessary knowledge, useless information. Okay, I know all kinds of useless stuff. Believe me, if you guys, I see nobody's disagreeing. Nobody's going, oh no, Stan, everything you say is important. Like, yeah, nobody's going, yeah, oh, could say that again. Okay, I know a lot of useless stuff, which is why it always worries me about Debbie's birthday, because that's important. It's like, what is her birthday? It's somewhere in May, kind of May, And I remember the useless thing that I'm 93 days older than her, so I have to, 93 was my birthday, okay, kind of thing. But important stuff, faith. That's interesting because, again, this is what's interesting. Paul is talking about these as manifestations of the Spirit, and these are the way the Spirit works. And when we get to the end of this chapter, we're going to find out that all of these manifestations of the Spirit all rely on one thing. Okay, and then we're going to talk about 1 Corinthians 13 and how 1 Corinthians 13 is part of this discussion. Okay, we all know 1 Corinthians 13. Oh, that's the love chapter. Debbie reminded me it's on our wall. We've got it hand stitched or cross stitched on our wall, kind of thing. And it's like, but chapter 13 is a part of the discussion in chapter 12. Okay, so faith, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, miraculous powers. Okay, healings, gifts. Now I'll tell you, I come from a very strong cessationist background. By a cessationist, I mean a person who believes that with the closing of the canon, that's right, once the Bible was completed, things like the gift of tongues ended, things like the gift of healing ended, miracles like that ended. We've got the Bible now. We needed those before the Bible. We have the Bible. And that also is going to come up in 1 Corinthians 13. When I see through a glass darkly, when that which is perfect is come, and that which is perfect is of course, is the Bible. Growing up, it was, that was it. I mean, right? Anyone else come from a cessationist background? So I'm not. I've ceased being a cessationist, if that makes sense, kind of thing. It's just you get to know after you start getting to know people who are in Assemblies of God or Pentecostal churches that are doing great works for the Lord. You kind of go. It's just there's this disconnect. You go, okay, wait a minute. How can I be so right? And kind of, there's just this disconnect sort of thing. And you meet people who are just godly, loving people who, like couple of our professors were full-on Pentecostal preachers. It doesn't mean I'm not personally, again, I'm just not super comfortable in that environment, but I'm like, hey, you guys, yeah. It's just kind of, how you grew up kind of affects, how you live. And our church is basically a cessationist. I don't know what would happen if somebody started speaking in tongues. Rebecca, why don't you today, middle of the, don't, just kidding. I'm going to edit this part out anyway, so if,
would be out of order.
yeah. It would be interesting. But we have been, our church, Debbie reminded me the other day that we have been involved in things. Our church, this church, First Baptist, with churches that are believe in tongues. I don't know what and you could be a Baptist and be a Pentecostal Baptist or a Pentecostal Baptist. So again, could these things still happen? Yeah. Why don't they? That's a good question. I don't know. Why don't we see them? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that question. Okay. In the New Testament, visible miracles occurred. Crippled arms were people who couldn't walk literally for years and years and years. Couldn't walk, stood up and started walking. People who were born blind could see. Okay. Do those still happen? There are books out there where people record where they have happened, usually in places where they don't have the gospel, that it's kind of a precursor to the gospel or the missionary work. So my point here is not to say, oh yeah, everything's cool. It's like, let's cease closing our minds to how the Spirit manifests itself. We don't have to say, I don't have to say, well, okay, I have to go speak in tongues. But if somebody else wants to, I'm like, hey, well, okay, if it's for the common good, that's the point. If it's for the common good, if the church is better off as a result of that, if somebody says I can do a healing for you if you pay me $1 million, I'm going to go, well, you know what? That's what hospitals are for. Pay $1 million to get healed. But be that as it may, I'm sorry, I got off the track here. Miraculous powers, prophecy, whether you want to call it knowing what's going to happen in the future. There are people that are, if you follow the financial markets, there are people who, and elections, political elections are the same thing, but especially in the financial markets, their prognostications are a great thing. Oh, the market's going to go up, the market's going to go down. And if there's a big event and you call it, so like if you call the big fall in 2008, the Great Recession in 2008, if you call that, then that's as good as a PhD in economics. Every business magazine in the world is going to quote you, and it'll say David Morrill, who called the 2008 recession, says about the 2021. Even if everything else is wrong, the fact that you called that right, but there are some people who can look at the situation and go, based on this and this is what I think is going to happen. And are they prophesying or are they, is it a gift of knowledge? I don't know. Is it a manifestation of the Spirit? Well, is it for the common good? Or you could do it, prophecy is the forthtelling kind of thing. That's kind of the way, that's the cessationist way around it, is to say, it's forthtelling. You're just giving forth, you're not foretelling. You're just giving forth God's truth kind of thing. Calling sin, sin, sort of stuff. Distinguishing between spirits, speaking in tongues, interpretation of tongues, these are all, again, a cessationist, I'm going, okay. But, distinguishing between spirits, the thing about that is we the West isn't really comfortable with this idea. In Eastern and certainly in like Africa and South America, I think they're much more comfortable with the idea that they're a manifest spirit. Well, we agree. We understand. Oh yeah, there's demons there. We get that. We understand that. But that something could be demonic or something is a manifestation of the Spirit, we're just not, we like knowing that we've pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps and we figured it out kind of thing. But Paul is saying, basically, here's the thing. That Paul is telling us here, this is how the Spirit manifests itself in the church. So, It's, if you don't think it's happening now, okay, I get it. But the Apostle Paul, he called the 2008 global things, So he gives these 8. Now these are not and again, there is no definitive list, and I'm getting into the idea of spiritual gifts. And spiritual gifts, there's multiple lists, things, and there is no definitive list of spiritual gifts. Every time spiritual gifts are discussed in the New Testament, there's a different combination. Okay? There's a different combination of one. So there is no definitive list of spiritual gifts. And a manifestation of the Spirit, I think really could be anything. I mean, that builds up the common good. That's the thing. It's got to build up the common good. The church has to be better off. The body has to be better off as a result of whatever that activity, action, thing, whatever is. Okay, so again, my point here, just immediate point is like, let's not, and I'm speaking to myself as much as I am to anyone else, so let's loosen up a bit, it's like, it's okay, kind of thing. Verses 11 here, all of these above are from the same Spirit, who gives these as only He determines. Okay? As only He determines them. All these are the work of one and the same Spirit, and He distributes them to each one just as He determines. Paul likens the way that these manifestations of the Spirit work together to the way the body works together. And this is an old, very common thing. Okay? Just as a body, human body, though one has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ. For we were all baptized by one Spirit so as to form one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slave or free, and we were all given the one Spirit to drink. Okay. Here he notes in verse 13 that some of the different groups, Jew, Gentile, slave, free, okay, this is probably the significant groups that are in, at least two of the dichotomies that are in Corinth. He's not listing all of them, okay, because in other places Paul talks about the rich versus the poor. Again, go back to chapter 11. What's the disparity in chapter 11? Or if you go into Galatians, he talks about there's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female. Okay, so again, this picture of this radical community of God that Paul gives, where the manifestation of the Spirit is welcomed and encouraged here. So like I said, it's not an exhausted list. No mention of rich or poor, etc. The next several verses is a well-known off-sided metaphor about how the human body works. Okay, and I wanted to stop here when he says we're all baptized by one Spirit so as to form one body. This is a verse that a lot of people have talked about. Say, okay, is he talking about the baptism of the Spirit? Is he talking about human baptism, kind of thing? I think Paul is drawing on this common experience of having gone from, because these guys are all first-generation believers. Okay, we went to the 50th anniversary of the church I grew up in Bolingbrook the other day, or not in July, I think it was June or July, and I was talking to the pastor there, the guy who'd been the pastor since 1976, and he talked about the start of the church, and one of the things he's talked about at the start of the church was how do you start a church with first-generation believers? Okay, people who had not gone through life as Christians. Okay, and he said, that's the difference. Most people, even now, he's talking to this church 50 years on, and he's like, you guys don't realize how different that is to try and create a church out of first generation believers, because they all have that experience, and I think Paul is referring to this common experience of having gone, for those of us who were saved at a very young age, it wasn't a life-changing experience. If you were saved between the ages of 5 and 10, you were probably not a whole lot different after you got saved than you were beforehand. Okay? Now, I don't know. Debbie got saved very young and gave up a deep lifetime of sin. Right there? Gave up smoking and wild living and all that stuff at the age of 5 or whatever it was. I'm kidding. She hasn't given up those. Kidding about that. I'll edit this part out.
Given them up, she still does it?
Yeah, the possibility is still.
Supposed to reveal these things.
I said I'd edit it out. I'm sorry. And I think he's just talking about this common experience sort of thing. And I think that's kind of an interesting point. Because, you talk about people who are like people who have been in the service. Okay, I was not in the service, but people who have been in the service. And one of the really interesting things about two people that are in the service, so if you get two guys that were both in the Marine Corps, never knew each other, never met, okay, and maybe you've seen this happen, and maybe it's happened to you if you've been in the service. This person has been in the Marine Corps, and you find out that this other person has been in the Marine Corps as well. Immediately, they're friends. Immediately, they have this common experience that nobody else understands that wasn't in the Marine Corps. And they're like, there's this camaraderie there from having been in that, even if their experience was good or bad. I mean, my dad was in the Marine Corps. His experience wasn't good. So that's a long story, okay? But he changed his mind so that by the end of his life, he was like Joe Marine, okay? But it was, so they have that common experience. If you went to a particular college, and you meet somebody who went to that same college as you, especially if it's a distinctive college. Okay, so again, I went to this particular school down in South Carolina, where if I find out somebody else went to South Carolina, first of all, you look at each other with suspicion and go, okay, where are you on the kind of... But then after a while, you're like, okay, we had the same experience. We know the same people. We know the same things. And, and again, college is the same way. It's that formative experience. And I think Paul is talking about this formative experience, having been through this here. But he gives this well-known metaphor about how the human body works. Verses 21 through 26 talks about the futility of ranking the body parts. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you, and the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And again, Paul here, he's probably talking about our private parts, for lack of a better word, because, without them, we wouldn't survive, but yet we hide them. I don't need you. On the contrary, these parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and the parts that we think are less honorable we treat with special honor, and the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, okay? While our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honor to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other, the common good. Okay? I mean, it's the kind of thing, like, imagine you get up at night, you walk into the bathroom, you're in bare feet, and you nail the dresser with your foot, okay? Right? How many have been there? You know what I'm talking about, right? At that moment, after you've hit the thing with your foot, how much of your body hurts? All of it. You are like, that is it. And all of the things you do is like, you can't scream kind of thing, sort of thing. And I mean, really, it's like, and to a certain extent, we've seen that, like when there's been a surprise passing in the church. It's like, whoa, and in a church of any size, you're going to have that happen. I mean, that's the closest where we get, where when one person hurts, everybody hurts. When there's a surprise, when Jim passed away, okay, or Larry, not Larry Morgan, well, Larry Morgan too. Pardon me? Larry Cavan. Yeah, it was like nobody, like, they were just here. We just talked to them, kind of thing. You know, everybody's like, realizes, ooh, you know, that common good. So that there should be no division. So here, 12:26 repeats, if one part suffers, every part does. If one part is honored, every part should rejoice. In verse 27, Paul makes the obvious more obvious. Now you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is part of it. Okay? I'm telling you, I told you all of that to say you are like the body. You may be a foot, you may be a head, you may be an arm. Okay? You may be the spleen. I want to be the spleen. I'm just kidding. And God has placed in the church, and now again, here he's got another list. Okay? Paul lists different responsibilities and manifestations of the Spirit in verse 28. And God has placed in the church, first of all, apostles, second, prophets, third, teachers, then miracles and gifts of healing, of helping, of guidance, and of different kinds of tongues. Are all apostles, are all prophets, are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all have the gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? Clearly the answer here should be no. We don't all do the same things. Okay? And we have to be comfortable with the idea of, okay, that's not my, yeah, you go. Do your thing. And again, to me, it's interesting that I look back on the years and years I spent looking at these. This is Paul's pretty clear. And God has placed in the church, first of all, apostles, second, prophets, which, of course, is a cessationist looks at that and goes, well, there are no more apostles. Apostles ended. Okay? There's no more apostles. There's no more prophecy because we've got the Bible. So whatever Paul says here, okay, that doesn't. You can believe in inspiration and inerrancy and look at that, yeah, except for that. It's just kind of I don't know. And there are good churches around that still do that. Again, I'm not as strong in that. Do all have the gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? No, not everybody's going to have every gift. Not everybody's going to serve every function. Not everybody is going to manifest the Spirit in the same way. But everybody is based on two things in common, or two things. One, whatever you do, if it's of God, it's going to be for the common good. And secondly, it's going to be based on what? Based on chapter 13. We'll talk about that next week. Any questions?
I think is it a good idea to make a list of what your spiritual gifts are? You assess yourself?
That's fine. I mean, if you have a question about where you fit in the church and you want to think about some of your abilities, that's certainly a good thing to do. Okay.
This is just a comment. I think sometimes we don't give ourselves credit for the gifts we have. Sometimes because they're so easy. I'm thinking about an older gentleman, named Leon Metcalf. He sat in a prayer meeting totally upset that he didn't know what his gift was. He didn't feel like he was any use to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And that gentleman would stand out in the foyer, greet people, learn their names, write their names down so he could greet them by name. The next Sunday, he just did that. And I said, are you kidding me? Look what you do. You make new people go home, and you greet them, and to him that didn't count. And that was a huge gift, of fellowship and that. So sometimes, we go crazy about gifts.
Well, yeah, that's the problem with trying to say, okay, we have to identify a particular gift.
Right.
And there are people that are clearly gifted in things. There's no question about it.
Well, I think some people confuse abilities with gifts, and God can use whatever ability you have spiritually. So I think that's the part that I think needs to be emphasized as well. I just have this ability, but it's not really a spiritual gift. Well, it becomes a spiritual gift when it's used for the common good. The Spirit works through you.
And we're going to come back to that next week in chapter 13. So you start talking about really what is a spiritual gift. Well, it's an ability. One could argue, and I don't want to give away my next. One could argue that a spiritual gift is an ability done in love for the benefit of the common good.
The
Okay, it isn't necessarily that, God said, okay, Rebecca, I'm going to give you the gift of fill in the blank. And now, again, that's the thing about the whole spiritual gift test. Again, me tests, and it's been a while since I've done one of those, because I'm like, I don't, it's like if I have a spiritual gift, people will tell you. That's my opinion. People will tell you what your spiritual gift is. So like with this guy, you're telling him. You're telling him this is your gift. And you think about the body analogy. Obviously, there are some parts of the body that are the parts of the body have different roles. Then you can there's a lot of parts of the body that you can live without. How many of you would just sure? I mean, think about it. I mean, how many of you still have your appendix? I do. Okay. Now we all know you can live without your appendix, right? So, have you ever seen a weight loss plan that said, first of all, have your appendix removed? We can live without it. Why not? Why not? We need to streamline. We need to get rid of this dead weight. Well, it's there for a reason. Just because science doesn't know exactly what the appendix does, doesn't mean it's not there for a reason. I mean, and it's gallbladder, spleen. We can live without these. We can live without one kidney, and there are people that do, voluntarily give up a kidney and things like that. It's like that doesn't mean we don't want to get rid of it. It's again, is it for the common good? Is it a spiritual gift? I mean, to me, welcoming somebody, shoveling the driveway,
One more comment, then we have to be better at telling people what we've seen. Because what if I don't speak up and say that? Like for me, a lot of people don't think hospitality is a big thing. Families who are able to welcome people into their home and they don't think that's a big deal. We have to come out and say, that's a gift of hospitality. You're the gift of hospitality. Thank you for doing that, so people know what it is.
Yeah, the Spirit's going to manifest itself in a lot of different ways. And when we see that, I think we should acknowledge it. Hey, that was great what you did there. I thought, and I think it's the thing is it's a much it's a much smaller thing. Someday, I've often thought about creating a message based on the Matthew passage about giving a cup of water in my name. That where Jesus talks about doing things for others. He doesn't talk about buying them a new house. He talks about giving a cup of water. We want to do big because we're Americans. Go big or go home. We want to create a program that fixes everything. When Jesus, in Matthew 20, 25, 26, Olivet Discourse, how's he going to know who his believers are? Because you gave a cup of water in my name. So, all right, well, listen, we got a service in 15 minutes, so come back next week. We're going to continue the discussion because it's not done.